Hi, welcome to Actual Spinster. My name is Anna Marie, and today I'm just going to talk about my books that I read in April. Before I get into the rest of the video, there is a GoFundMe link in the description box for a campaign for Ala and her family whilst they're stuck in Gaza. If you can check that out, I would be grateful. I would say April's reading wasn't especially successful for me in the sense of enjoyment, but it was fine. It was a pretty intensive and exhausting month, so I didn't have that much time for my own personal reading, and then also all the time that I did have for my personal reading, I wasn't up for engaging with some of the things I wanted to, so instead was reading children's books, which still take engagement but just tend to be somewhat easier to read and experience and follow, especially when you're exhausted. I did also talk about some of these books in varying degrees of depth in the April reading and PhD vlog that I made. But yeah, so the first book I read in April was The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. I listened to this on audio. I thought it was pretty mid, I guess. I kind of just felt a bit what was the point? Obviously this is a very famous piece of science fiction, and it's also famous in the sense that it's kind of blueprint for what science fiction is or can be. It's just highly influential, and you can really see that it has had a profound influence on the genre and on the stories that are told, and also on the conceptualization of aliens, alien invasion, and also colonization too, as a part of that kind of discussion. But at the same time, I kind of also felt that was pretty lacking, or at least that's part of me that was what was the point of that? Because I just sort of felt what exactly is the takeaway, especially because of how it ends. It just starts to feel a bit almost a sort of random act that somewhat exposes the vulnerability of Britain and the British Empire, but also is ultimately just sort of contained into science and the sort of reality of biological infection or something. Which, yeah, I don't know. I did read this a while ago. I do think that one thing that was quite interesting to me about it was the very specific emphasis on place, in a way that felt very kind of connected with this idea of mapping a space, and super kind of attentive to the way that places change with sort of colonial impact, I guess, but in this sense alien invasion. And yeah, I don't know, there's something about mapping and colonization there that I thought was sort of interesting, but I don't know. I've barely really thought about it since I read it. I would like to read some stuff about it in terms of maybe its publishing history and just periodical serialization. So if you do have any recommendations for that, let me know. I have also read a little section of a book that talked about it, which was by I think a man named John, and it was about the creation of science fiction and colonization and thinking about the relationship there. And also because in The War of the Worlds, human versus human colonization, specifically in terms of Australia, I think, and maybe Tasmania in specific, is mentioned. So that very specific parallel also in the very beginning of the story was also something that I felt was a bit I don't know that I want to say underutilized. I guess I mean underexplored. It just felt a kind of glib reference to genocide of Aboriginal people, and then this story about the survival of this one British man scientist and his wife or whatever. And yeah, I don't know, there's almost a way that the alien invasion was actually sort of outside of colonization as a framework. It was almost extra colonization, and so as a result it wasn't we were never really returned to this idea. I guess I kind of felt maybe some of the characters should have had more reflection then on their own role and backing of imperial projects, or their participation in genocide, for it to be actually saying something. I mean, yeah, I don't know. And I also don't really want to say that I think it was a really subtle book about it, because I don't think it was subtle at all. So I feel why be really unsubtle about some things and then really subtle about this idea of colonization and I don't know, British understanding of what it might mean to be on the other side of a genocidal and colonial force. I don't know. Anyway, moving on. The next book I read, also science fiction actually, and also one of the beginning in science fictional tales, I guess, was Sultana's Dream by Rokeya Sakawat Hossein, or sometimes she's called Begum Rokeya, I think. And this has illustrations by Durga Bai, which is partially why I wanted this edition. I really enjoyed the illustrations. I do, like, this was 60 pages, I think, if that. So it's pretty small, especially when you consider that there's illustrations, and also that's probably the most amount of text on a page. You know, sometimes there's much less too. So I would say it's like a very slight kind of story. Basically, it's just about this woman who goes to sleep and then she has this dream, and she thinks she's woken up, you know, and there's this woman who she thinks is her friend who invites her outside, and she's in a completely different world, and that world is like Ladyland. And yeah, it's, you know, it's one of those books that feels both intriguing and also quite limited. I did like how there's a sort of focus on some of the like scientific developments that women like contributed to and like developed outside and against what the men were doing, especially in terms of like energy, and so like in terms of like solar power and also like wind power or like rain power. I can't quite remember now. And there is this like sense of trying to live like more reciprocally and carefully with like nature and then land, and like in terms of like production and stuff. Yeah, it's an interesting novel. It's also kind of silly, and like there's you know, like all the men are kind of like locked away. Women normally live in Pada or in, is it Zananas? And instead now, or in Ladyland, men are like kept separate instead because they are still considered a threat. Like, I think there is a way that it's quite like, I don't know, like it was an interesting book, but in terms of gender stuff I felt it was also a little bit hard to get behind, I guess. But then at the same time, like, I also thought that it did feel quite different to things that say, instead of saying like the inverse of what the sort of patriarchal image of a woman is, so instead focusing on like her strength, like her physical strength or whatever, it kind of says, no, the patriarchal image of the woman is somewhat correct, but the way to deal with that weakness of women is not to lock women away, but instead to lock men, because they're the aggressors. It's from 1905. It was definitely an interesting read, and I would recommend it if you're like interested in like science fiction stuff. I also think that Rokeya Sakawat Hossein sounds like a really interesting woman. She was like a pioneer for like women's education and stuff like that, and she like also, I think, often criticised very intense forms of like women's seclusion, because she thought that that was like bad for them. There's another book by her that has made me more interested, like that I think sounds more interesting, I guess, than this, which I think is called Padamarag. Could be wrong, and it's translated from Bengali, I think, and that is something that I would like to read someday. This month I actually also did finish my annual reread of one of the Tiffany Aching series, and so this time it was time for I Shall Wear Midnight, which I think is one of the best books ever written. It's just so good, and like, I love Terry Pratchett so much. I won't talk loads about it. I've talked about it before. Like, I think this is maybe the third time I've reread it, which is like a little bit less than some of the others maybe, but I could be wrong. But it's because I started the series and then I immediately started rereading the series as I was continuing to read it. So I definitely have reread the second book, which names escape me, A Hatful of Sky, I think maybe more times than 3, but I also could be wrong. I kind of feel like maybe that's not true anymore. So yeah, I still have only read The Shepherd's Crown once, and that would be the one that I'll go to next, because obviously I'm rereading the whole series. But I just think The Shepherd's Crown is like not very good. I think it's a really sad ending to what is like an incredible series, and obviously going from I Shall Wear Midnight, which is again one of the best books in the entire world, to The Shepherd's Crown is like a real nosedive. And you know, I just think like it brings in things that are just like super underdeveloped in comparison with how like I feel like steadily Terry Pratchett had been developing these ideas around care and labour and gender and witchcraft, obviously, in this sense, in a way that I kind of struggle with and just feel quite disappointed in. So yeah, but I mean, maybe I'll enjoy it more on a reread because I'm going in having already read it and not being like, this is the final book that Terry Pratchett wrote. I don't know, anyway, maybe I'll enjoy it more on the second time when I get to it, but I mean, I'm not gonna like start reading it anytime soon. I say that I probably will because now I've said that. But I like started rereading I Shall Wear Midnight like quite a long time ago, and then it was just like in the last month I wanted something like comforting to listen to, so I listened to it a bit more steadily. The next two books I read were from the Dale-Mark Quartet by Diana Wynne Jones, and the first one I read was Cart and Quidder, and the second one was Drowned Amit. I listened to both of these on audio, and I partially listened to them because I started listening to a podcast that was nominated for the Hugos, in like the fan cast section, which is called 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones, and it's hosted by two authors who write science fiction and fantasy and whose names I cannot remember, but it's an easy to find podcast, and so they're focusing on doing 8 episodes for each decade of Diana Wynne Jones's writing. So this first season they looked at the 1970s, and the Dale-Mark Quartet, 3 out of the 4 of them were written in the 1970s, and they're like published in a slightly different order than their sort of chronology in terms of the books themselves like are, but I am going to just read them in the publication order, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I haven't really felt the like desire to pick up the third one, so I don't know, we'll see. Which actually I think the third one is then in like the first one in terms of the like chronology of the like book world, like the internal world of the books. It feels kind of strange to try and describe why I was like a bit obsessed with them. I think part of it was like stress and just like the desire to escape, and they were quite good for that. But I also do think that one thing I really like about Diana Wynne Jones's work is the way that she does like engage with myth, because I feel like sometimes the way that like authors construct myths and also their specific relevance to like non-mythical society, so like the contemporary world in terms of these books, is that they'll say like this is the myth that this group of people have, and then the myth is very static and it means like the same thing in like most places, and it doesn't really change. It's not like sort of subject to like differences of location or I don't know, like proximity to various things like weather events or kinds of landscapes or whatever, which doesn't feel very like accurate to how myths work and move in the world and how humans make them have multiple and various meanings at different points in time and in different places. And whereas I felt like with Cart and Quidder and Drowned Amit, it's very clear that she has like a much more complicated and also therefore like accurate understanding of how myths work, and I just like that as the sort of like, because I feel like sometimes it's like fantasy stories, they just are like, okay, we need a myth, so we'll pick one, and then it will just be like the background and we won't really like consider it as like how understanding this myth or like caring about some aspect of it, or even just having like a ritual practice that is supposedly drawing back to it, but like people no longer really believe in the myth itself, but they still do the practice. Like having that included in the world, I feel like is really accurate, meaningful to how humans engage with things, you know, and how like time distorts and I don't know, refracts what things might have originally meant versus what they do mean now, and then in different places there might be different like knowledge. Cart and Quidder is also about music, and I thought that was also a nice aspect too. So these are stories set in this particular world called Dale-Mark, and there's a South Dale-Mark and a North Dale-Mark, and they are not like happy with each other. And most of the time we're in South Dale-Mark, but we have like northern Dale-Mark sympathies. I suppose that's more true of Cart and Quidder. And Cart and Quidder follows this like group of like this family of like traveling musicians who travel from town to town, and they pass on like information and things like that. And we also learn that it's like very dangerous to be like pro-North or a northerner at all in the South. This family takes this traveller with them through their towns on their journey through the South, and things happen, and there's like a big instrument called a quidder, which I think, now I can't remember, but I think it's sort of described as maybe a big violin, or now I'm like, was it an organ? But I don't think it was an organ, but I can't remember. And I just really enjoyed it. It also felt like especially Cart and Quidder, it felt like a actually quite like, I guess I have to say mythical again, world or something. There was something, it was more like medieval. There was something kind of medieval about it. Like there's a strange like sort of emotional disconnect where these like children are experiencing a lot of like horrible stuff, but at the same time like it feels quite flat. And then there are these moments of like a sort of like peak of like emotionality, but even then like it's somewhat decentered from the like actual character, which just felt like quite medieval writing, and I don't know. And then Drowned Amit is like definitely less enjoyable to me, but it was also interesting, but also honestly kind of baffling. in terms of like Diana Wynne Jones and her like take on politics. And she was writing these in the 1970s, and I think ultimately Dalemark is more of like a Wales than an Ireland, but like I think also she can't have helped but be in some way like sort of refiguring or like reinterpreting some of the things going on during the Troubles in the 1970s in Ireland, especially in terms of Dreamt Amit. Like it's very focused and interested in like, oh, I forgot the word and I got a headache. Freedom fighting, terrorism, and also like specifically youth involvement in those things. And like it's just like, I mean, I do think it's like politically incoherent, and like it just is completely, it's completely politically incoherent, but at the same time, like, I don't know, it was very interesting and it was very compelling to me, and I'm not sure if it actually is. But that was definitely my experience with it. I don't know, really strange. I've read some Diana Wynne Jones before and I really didn't enjoy it, which is also, I suppose, why it was like surprising to me that I did enjoy these, or like I became kind of hooked, especially by Carton Quitter, which I kind of wanted to reread after I had finished it, which doesn't really happen to me very often anymore, where I'm like, oh, I immediately wish I could reread that, which I obviously could have, I guess, but I decided to try not to do that. One of the things that I really struggled with her other work, some of which I have read, which is from the 70s, I think, because I think she did the Charmed Life from the 70s, so I have read that one, which is in the Chrestomanci series, which is what I have read the most of by her. But I just felt like there was loads of horrible fat phobia in that. Like I really hated how she was writing about like fat children and being fat as this like evil thing, and I felt that way about throughout the Chrestomanci series mostly, but there wasn't so much of that in here. Occasionally I did feel like she was just describing a character as fat, and like that was supposed to be like enough of a description of them, because like fat is just such like a descriptive word or something, and it has so much meaning. Not that the characters that were described as fat were like then being like evil, but it was just like, okay, it's enough, you've got this clear idea of this person because they're fat, which I don't like. And I will say in Dreamt Amit, which again I also kind of wish, like I think that 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones do not talk about like the fat phobia at all, in a way that I really don't like, and I think that they should, because it's like very clear and very part of like these children's books, and I think like it's very meaningful that like children's books are like hyper focused on being fat as an evil thing, because like that tells you so much about like what people are teaching like children, and like trying to sort of narrativize about and moralize about like bodies and appetite and fatness, which are all things I think we should like chill out about and be okay with like people being fat, because it's not a moral failing. Yes, but in terms of Dreamt Amit, there is a character who is disabled. He's like mentally disabled, and they use, I can't remember what term it is now, but they definitely use like a term that I don't like for that person, and the person is like being manipulated by an evil person, so it's like clear that he, like the bad person is more cruel because he's doing it. But I just felt like, yeah, the representation of that was like not very nice and like not very sensitive at all. It's really strange to put like this group of books all together, I guess, because like after reading those like random children's books, I then read Maman, What Are We Called Now by Jacqueline Mesnil-Amar, translated by Francine York. And this is like a short diary, basically. Jacqueline Mesnil-Amar, she and her husband and also her daughter, they live in Paris, which was occupied by the Germans during World War II. Their own history doesn't just revolve around living in Paris. Like they moved a lot during the war through, I think, like various places in Vichy France, which is where like the French government was, who had this like agreement that they would like surrender any citizens to the Germans, which is why some parts of France were occupied by the Nazis, and some parts were like still being kind of legislated by the French government. But I mean, like the French government were collaborationists. Just, I think there were some differences between living in these different zones, but at the same time, like the level of safety for like, for example, Jewish French people and then also Jews who fled to France as refugees and stuff was like fairly bad everywhere, but then also worse in the occupied zones. I guess I would say, like, obviously I'm not an expert on this, but anyway, so this diary covers this particular period of time where Paris becomes unoccupied because like the Germans are defeated and they retreat, and also it's a time when Jacqueline Mesnil-Amar's husband Andre, who is part of like, I can't remember what they're actually called, but like Organisation de Juifs or something, like this Jewish resistance network, they did this, or they were trying to do this particular thing, and he goes missing basically, and so she doesn't know where he is. It's, you know, a very intense, and it's also exceptionally vivid. Like it is so incredibly written, like it just feels so vivid, and the atmosphere and also just like the place of it was incredible. Like Paris was so alive, and like so alive to Jacqueline Mesnil-Amar. I'm gonna like cry thinking about it. The way she feels like so connected to the place, and also so angry and hurt by the way that like Jewish people have been treated and French Jews, and then also she does defend foreign Jews. There's clearly some hierarchies. It's also just very interesting in terms of learning about it all. Like obviously, I mean, French Jews were very assimilated to French society. I think a little bit like Italian Jews, who were also pretty shocked in terms of what started to happen to them. And yeah, and like Jacqueline Mesnil-Amar comes from like a, you know, middle class, like bourgeois background. Like she thought herself to be French. The sort of behaviours made her certainly question that and question her position and her relationship there. But anyway, I'm doing a really bad job. I feel like it's quite hard to like say, because I just think that this is like a book that like is just like an experience and like good to experience and read. There's obviously like a lot of sad stuff. Actually, I would say two things that I really didn't like about it, in the sense of like how it's presented. So the French title is Ce qui ne dormait pas, and obviously the English title is Maman, What Are We Called Now? And the title Maman, What Are We Called Now does actually come from something that Jacqueline Mesnil-Amar's like child, Sylvia? I can't remember, but she says to she's like 10 or something during this particular time, and so she says that to her mother. And like Jacqueline, I don't know, it feels weird to call her Jacqueline, but it also feels weird to call her Mesnil-Amar, but like she is like kind of shocked by that, and like it sort of sparks her feeling like worried about what her kid has kind of taken in from growing up in this like very difficult time. There's lots of hiding, there's lots of being exceptionally stressed. But I actually think that the title in French, which is something like Those That Don't Sleep, is much better, because one of her kind of central reflections on what it is like to be Jewish in these moments, and there's quite a lot of reflecting too, in terms of like her memories and where else she's been and like stuff like that, is this idea of like, I think even at one point she says like being Jewish, it becomes even more meaningful and like present as an identity and characteristic during the nighttime, because you can't sleep when you're Jewish at night during this time, because there's just this absolute terror that like the Gestapo are gonna like come in, or you're gonna be taken away, you're gonna be put in Drancy, which is this awful like prison place where they kept loads of people, or you're gonna be deported from Drancy or wherever to Auschwitz, or yeah. So I just kind of feel like Maman, What Are We Called Now doesn't really get the vibe. And there is like a focus from Jacqueline Mesnil-Amar on like children and like the children of the war, and especially like the orphans afterwards, which she writes about like after. But I actually think that it doesn't feel like, yeah, I don't know, like I didn't really like how they made that choice. I've given this book 5 stars, like this is not, you know. But one thing they also did with this, which I don't know if is accurate to the French edition, yeah, so like this, it starts with saying Diary of a Tragic Time, like part 1 or something. We get to the 25th of August midnight, and then there's photographs, just like a random interlude of photographs, which all focus on children. And they're like, you know, very intense, and these documents of these like children of the war photographs. But it didn't really work for me. And then there's a part 2, From Tragic Times to Difficult Times. And there's like an introduction from, like there's a way that the diary is really weirdly interrupted, but then actually at the same time there's still diary entries in this. And also, but then it's not clear which parts, because she started writing for like a newsletter, I believe, for like, I don't remember what it was called, something about like, you know, rescuing Israelites, which is to say like Jews who were in Eastern Europe and stuff like that, and trying to find out more information and like what had happened to people and stuff like that. And so there are like dates for these things. So this is like the 5th of May 1946, and it's called Childhood Lost and Regained, but I'm not sure where it was published, and I don't really like that, because in her introduction to this section it does seem like it was published. Yeah, it does say that these articles first appeared in the Bulletin de Service Central des Déportés Israélites. But I don't know. I found this like, because some of them also aren't dated at all. Anyway, I just, yeah, felt like the structure of this didn't work very well, but I think like the diary aspect of it, especially that first chunk, was just incredible. And I think I don't think I like politically agree with like everything Jacqueline Mesnil-Amar says, but I do think that she writes about things incredibly, and I think she sometimes really is speaking with a clarity and an integrity that's really incredible. She also talks about post-war stuff that I also felt was very interesting as someone who is like learning more about the Holocaust right now and feeling like people don't talk about it enough, and people have like acted as if these things are like complete and finished and over, when I don't think that's true. And obviously one of the reasons why we're in this awful mess that we're in today is partially because I don't think we like ever really responded appropriately to what had happened, or were actively anti-fascist and anti-Nazi enough to be that way, and also in the sense of like allowing anti-immigrant sentiment to foster, which it was itself this powerful tool like in Nazi ideology and continues to be to this day. So yeah, I don't know, I thought that was really interesting, because she also was obviously alive during the like trials, and especially like the first trials like after the war, and also in terms of France itself, where like this sort of image of de Gaulle as this like great liberator, and then he was basically like, okay, we need to like move on and not talk about this anymore. So people being like, why are you dwelling on those dark times, we need to move forward. But then like people who were collaborationists, people who made a shit ton of money from like selling, you know, Jewish like hiding places and just like denouncing where Jews were hiding to like Germans and stuff, like they just made a shit ton of money off that. Those people, like, what happened to them? They weren't taken to trial, you know, maybe some of them were like the worst of them, but also the level of complicity. I think that's really what she's trying to like speak to, is this level of complicity that is like sickening, and that was still baked in to like French society. I'm gonna read this bit. Everyone now knows what happened. Nobody wants to hear about it anymore. They brush the subject aside. It's too unpleasant. There's no point, they say again and again. We know all about it. Of course we know. We know how many children were sacrificed. We know about the war on children, the persecution. We know all about that. But what is knowledge? Knowledge is like love. The light of knowledge must be fueled and kept burning. Otherwise the facts will shrivel until they are no more than pale abstractions barely weighing on our too swiftly eased consciences. Like love, without passion, knowledge is nothing. Knowing is not enough, not for us, not for others, and certainly not for those who have forgotten what they once knew. The time comes when it is necessary to break the silence that has gripped the whole world, and which begins to feel too much like indifference, or worse, like complicity. Yeah. I did also DNF 2 books this month. I DNF'd Dicty by Teresa Hack Young Chow, which I talked about in that reading vlog, which I won't go over now. It was just not the book for me. I'm sure other people will love it, and I hope that they find it and do. I did also try to read In the Blink of an Eye by Ali Bacon, but I literally just started reading and was like, I don't care. And obviously it's quite a short book, so normally if you're like, maybe you would still keep reading because it's a short book, but I just like really didn't care, so gave up on that one. Whew. So I think that is everything I had to share today. Pretty intense stuff at points. Please let me know if you've read any of these books and want to talk to me about them. I would definitely appreciate that. I'd also really be interested in if you have any recommendations for books that talk about like Vichy France, or like France as a whole during the Second World War in terms of the occupied versus the unoccupied zone. I do actually have the journal of Hélène Baer coming to me, because I'd like to read that at some point, which is this like French Jewish woman's journal of her time in Paris. I think she lived all the time until she was deported to Auschwitz, and it's actually like the woman who wrote that, like Hélène, is mentioned in this twice, I think, and so it was already on my radar, but after reading this I was like, I obviously have to pick that up too. I was also thinking about like the way that like a lot of these diaries are by women that are about experiences during the Second World War and like of the Holocaust and stuff, which I don't know, are there many by men? Like I feel like I don't know like any. I was, obviously that's the most famous Anne Frank, and then obviously there's some others that are slightly less famous. My camera is lying on it right now, but I have the diary of Ruth Meyer to read because I was looking for like Norwegian Jewish stuff, and she lived in Norway. She's an Austrian Jew, but yeah, she lived there until she was also deported to Auschwitz, so I'd like to read that at some point. But yeah, again, like another woman, they all just a lot of them seem to be women. Obviously I'm also just interested in women, but it's sort of interesting because there's quite a lot of academic discussion about the way that the Holocaust is very gendered, but in terms of like men and masculinity and their experiences, and so bringing in women's experiences is a way to like get a more grounded and wider and more nuanced and also more comprehensive than picture of like what the Holocaust was like. But then in terms of kind of like people's personal experiences and like their diaries and journals, it does feel like there's more women and also girls whose diaries have been published. Obviously I think that I guess could be definitely connected with this idea of like women being these like confessional writing people, and like that's sort of more what women do than like writing fiction or whatever, and they can be like an expert on themselves but not very much like other things. So maybe there's that kind of prioritizing of their diaries in that sense, but I don't know. Anyway, I'd love your thoughts on that or anything else I said. Have you read the Dale-Mark Quartet? Please let me know. It's just like really bizarre, like what's going on there, you know? I just want to know. Yeah, I hope you're having a good day when you're watching this, and I will talk to you when I next talk to you. Bye.